Good morning. So where were we? Well, we pounded through chapter 10, which we probably could have taken in over a couple of weeks because it's just such good stuff. So now we're going to start getting into all the different laws of Leviticus. So let's check it out. Leviticus chapter 11 says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Speak to the children of Israel. These are the animals which you may eat among all the animals on the earth." And so it's among the animals whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, and chewing the cud, that you may eat. So we're talking about ruminants, animals that have more than one stomach, and they kind of send it from one stomach to the other. Cattle, sheep, deer, giraffes, camels. I mean, those are things that fall into that category. "Nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those that chew the cud, or those that have the cloven hooves." So the camel, so it's, it might qualify for one thing, but it's disqualified for the other. And so he goes down and just starts listing these guys off. The rock, hyrax, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean. The hare, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean. Swine, though it has the divided hoof and the cloven hooves, it does not chew the cud. And so you just go on down the list. And pigs were no less or more unclean than eating a hare. Though pigs were very common food for other people. I mean, so that's a very popular food. So that's probably why pigs stand out as the food that they don't eat. Camel is not as a common delicacy. And so he mentions that the things in the water, whatever has fins and scales. So for instance, a catfish doesn't have scales, so catfish are not kosher. And so if it doesn't have those things, then you may not eat them. So this means no shellfish, no shrimp, right? If it's from the water, it has to have fins and scales. And then these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds, right? The eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, kite, falcon, raven, ostrich, short-eared owl, seagull. It just goes down the list. And last but not least in that list of birds or flying animals is the bat. No eating bats. So there you go. And in verse 20, it starts with the insects. Now you'd think, wow, they're not allowed to eat pig, but they can eat insects. But of course, yes, you may eat locust, verse 22, destroying locust, the cricket, the grasshopper. But other flying insects you may not eat. And so, yeah, specifically going over all these foods they can have. So, John the Baptist had his wild honey and his locusts, grasshoppers. Grasshoppers, fry them over the fire, dip them in some honey, call it a day. So again, these are all the animals, and then he goes up to list unclean animals, right? Verse 24. "But by these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of them shall be unclean." So the carcass of an animal, right? Which divides the foot but is not a cloven. It goes down the whole list. Whatever goes on its paws, whoever carries any such carcass shall wash his clothes, be unclean till evening. "And there also shall be unclean to you the creeping things, the mouse, the mole, the large lizard after its kind, gecko, monitor lizard, sand reptile, sand lizard, chameleon." So you go down this list, and it continues to talk about all these different unclean animals. And it says, anything in which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean, whether it is an item of wood or clothing, skin or sack, whatever the item is, in which any work is done, it must be put in water, and it shall be unclean till evening. "Any earthen vessel into which any of them falls, you shall break, and whatever is in them shall be unclean. In such a vessel, any edible food upon which water falls becomes unclean, and any drink that may be drunk is unclean, and everything which is on the part of any such carcass shall be unclean." Where is it? "Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern which has plenty of water, it shall be clean. But whatever touches any carcass shall become unclean. So it's saying that if a dead animal, that's an unclean animal that you can't eat, falls into a standing water source, all that water is unclean. So like a cistern. But then if you fall into, or a spring or a cistern, sorry, where there's plenty of water. So a cistern's really, really large, so it's okay. But like a pot of water. A spring or a cistern, which is really big, it's still okay because it's a small amount. Now let's see if I can find what I'm looking for here. Any animal which you may eat dies. He who touches a carcass shall be unclean till evening. He who eats its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean till evening. He who carries its carcass shall be unclean till evening. Crawls on its belly. Creeping things. You shall consecrate yourselves. Interesting. Where am I trying to find? Any earthen vessel into which any of them falls, you shall break it. Verse 33. Now I wonder if the cross-reference I'm looking for... No, that's not it. Well, we've gotten through all these unclean things. And what's the why? Down in verse 45, for I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall perform, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the animals, the birds, the living creature that moves on the waters, every creature that creeps on the earth, to distinguish between unclean and the clean, between the animal that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten. So here's the whole chapter on animals that you can eat and you can't eat. And I did skim over a bunch, because if you read it, I mean, it's very straightforward. Here's the list of animals. It's kind of repetitive because God is trying to be really clear that there's no confusion. He's trying to, for one, have his people be set apart from other people. They have a special diet that they follow that other people don't follow. Secondly, many of these unclean animals were legitimately unhealthy for them to eat. Now, some of that is because in those days, just the cleanliness of the animals. For instance, today even, quite often, food poisoning is most common with seafood. Now, you can get food poisoning from lots of things, but we've noticed that often shellfish, shrimp, or some bad seafood is quite often probably one of the higher causes of food poisoning. Well, back then, they didn't have as good a way to keep things cold and to keep things preserved and to get things clean. And so you'll find that God was giving them very strict rules on the animals that were more clean and more healthy to eat, but it also set them apart from other people. Now, some of this had to do with ritual uncleanliness. It wasn't sinfulness. It was ritual uncleanliness. You were unclean ritually. And the verse is evading me at this point. But where it talks about, if it falls into an earthen vessel, you shall break it. It is unclean. Well, what's funny is that in another passage, and it's probably in Deuteronomy or Numbers, I just don't have a cross-reference written down, but I should look it up later, is it says that when this happens, you shouldn't give the pot to your neighbor because you're supposed to break the pot. But of course, you could give it to your neighbor and your neighbor would never know. Right? And this is the irony, is that with some of these cleanliness, laws, there's also some practicality in it, that we see that God has to tell us, this is an unclean thing, it should be destroyed. Don't just give it to your neighbor as a gift, because rather than destroy it, well, you'd rather, get some credit out of it and, maybe do a nice thing for your neighbor and give them, hey, look at this, I'm going to give you this pot of grain. Here you go. And I just like the idea that the Bible comes down to my level. My level being, don't give defiled pots to your neighbor. Now, if my neighbors are watching, don't worry. All the pots I give you are totally fine. But there's a principle there that God has to stoop down to our level and realize, that's the kind of stuff we would pull. That's the kind of stuff people like you and I are prone to do, is we'll give a pot that should be destroyed to our neighbor. We will, kind of go behind the back and do something we ought not do, but no one will be the wiser. And that just reminds me again of when you look at the commandment of not bearing false witness. It doesn't mean don't tell lies. It means don't be deceptive in any way, shape, or form. It means don't withhold information from someone who really rightfully deserves to know that information. My best example of that one is like when you borrow someone's car and you know for a fact that you totally scratched the side of the car. Well, if you return to it and hope they don't notice, that's bearing false witness. Well, I didn't tell them it. I know. And that's you just trying to justify your sin. And so it's just God comes down to our level and he deals with us in those little things. And more he reveals to us just how sinful our sin nature is. That, yeah, like I'm the kind of guy who would find the mouse in my pot. I know I'm supposed to destroy the pot, but I mean, that's like $50 right there. And I don't want to, well, you know what? I'll give it to the neighbors. Take the mouse out, scrape up, I'll scrape the top layer of grain off because I'm a good guy. And then I'll give the pot, hey guys, I just wanted to give you this pot full of grain because I just want to bless you. And they're like, aw, you're so considerate. And you're like, thank you, I know. And you give away the pot. So I'll have to go look up that cross-reference and maybe I'll post it in the description later. But clean and unclean animals. This applied to the Jews. There were practical reasons. And there were also spiritual reasons. And I don't want to start a whole other topic, but again, we're going to see some of the rules that God made for his people simply to make them different. And while today so many in the church are trying to relate to the world and like how can we make connections with all these worldly people, God was here in the Bible trying to tell his people, I want you guys to be different. I want people when they see you and observe you like, oh, that's a Jew because they're different. And it would not be a bad thing today if people looked at Christians and we don't need to wear a special outfit. We don't need to all dress the same or do something, that's like making rules where there are no rules. But it should be quick and easy to tell that that's a Christian and they're different. All right. God bless you guys. We can talk about rituals after childbirth and maybe even get to leprosy tomorrow. Sounds exciting. I'll see you guys then.